Some of us may recognize this paperback volume from Voices United Sampler. It was circa 1993. It was published in advance of the hymn book we all know and love as Voices United. It's sort of nice to hold on to one of these again. It was a sample of traditional and new hymns for what has been a resilient source of our life in worship together. And this morning I suggested we gather with Beethoven's Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You, because as they canvassed the whole church in 1993, it was the most popular traditional hymn in the country for our denomination. And the most popular new hymn, which we'll hear at the end of the service, was Natalie Sleeth's composition for her grandchildren, In the Bulb There Is a Flower. Unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see. Sleeth's husband was dying, and she wanted to write something for their grandchildren to sing and to ponder at his funeral, and alas, not long after they sang it at hers. This past year has seemed to have a lot more to do with something God alone can see than Joyful, Joyful. But I need to echo deep appreciation to the staff team here, gathered and remembered, and volunteers, as well as soloists and choristers and readers and other congregational leaders this morning, including Patrick and Judy and Michael on the tech desk. It's so good to be back in the sanctuary, as I said. Initially with live stream and to be worked out in September. I remain cautiously optimistic that public health measures pursued by local authorities and individual citizens, combined with increasing rates of vaccination and so-called passports, will guide us to a new normal. Since I retired from hospital chaplaincy soon 4 years ago, I've been privileged to be working part-time in Waterloo Region at what I call a large version of the Morley Bedford Family Funeral Home. They didn't pay me to say that, but it gives you some sense. This is called Urban Good in Waterloo. And I spend most of my time presiding at funerals for families that don't have a faith leader or helping the director in some other way. And it has been quite a journey for those families and other leaders. We've been encouraging, not to speak for the funeral home, but I think for the profession, for families of a loved one who has died to do something, to have some kind of a ritual. It might be a visitation for 10 people at a time, a live stream service, a gathering at graveside, mindful that a deferred service may be months away. Though some families may seek or need permission not to have that deferred service, particularly if they've done something else as their journey of grief is well underway. I think back to some of the training I received as a student at Timothy Eaton Memorial United Church, where I was a candidate when Eric Bacon, our minister emeritus here, was the administrator, and then we announced about the same time we were going coast to coast to seminary in our second or third careers. We were protégés of the Reverend Dr. Doug Lobb, and he taught us a lot of things, including about weddings and funerals. So many of the letters in the Bible are attributed to St. Paul, but quite frankly, he couldn't possibly have written all of them because he didn't. Some of his protégés wrote for him, and that was part of their homage to his teaching in their lives. Reflections on the risen Christ, risen in the body of Christ, the church, and making meaning of things that sometimes only God alone can see, and other challenges and tolls of building up the kingdom of peace with justice that Jesus came to proclaim. Now, back at the hospital, I mentioned that workshop with Annette and the Slinky, and there was a doctor who often came to those sessions in support of the nurses that she worked with, and she offered me a phrase that seemed to be inspired by the epistle to the Hebrews that Carol read for us earlier, that likely a fellow named Barnabas wrote. We'll come back to Barnabas in a moment, but it was attributed to St. Paul. That doctor is quoted as saying many times since, hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. Hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. And then she would add, and sometimes our hopes change. Sometimes our hopes change. I also remember her saying you can substitute the word prayer for hope. Prayer is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. Well, it is Barnabas who reminds us in the letter to the Hebrews that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And what is seen is made from things not visible. While working as a hospital chaplain, when it was my privilege to meet with patients and families and staff who were struggling with difficult decisions, we would often end up talking about hope. And then sometimes I would invite them to imagine a window that had 4 panels. I've written it on the back of serviettes and menus in the cafeteria, whatever we could get our hands on, to look at envisage a horizon that they want to be a part of, mindful that sometimes hopes are changing. This is a model that was actually developed for students at the UBC Medical School back in the 1990s, about the same time that the Voices United Sampler was brought together. And each of the panels today, and I'm going to refer to this beside me, and today it's a mirror, but maybe that's fitting. Patrick says it's picking up a light that makes it look like a candle. And of course, the Spirit arranged that. But I just want to recap some of these panels and then tell you a couple of quick stories through pandemic that reminded me. So this top corner we think of as medical advice or expert advice, and for a patient it's about their illness. But just as important is below that, what are the patient's wishes? Just as important. And I've confused you already. Medical advice, this is quality of life that comes out of what the doctor has said, but I want to say beside is the patient, just as important as the physician. What are their wishes? And that brings us to the final corner, which is around values and context. Through this year of pandemic in particular, I've been aware of many stories of resilience. Some of them fit into these window panels, and helpfully, people are living into those stories to envisage that future. I want to give you 2 examples, 2 from weddings, 2 from funerals, and all the stories are used with consent. Beginning in that top corner, which talks about expert advice, Stephen can probably relate to this, couples who've rebooked their wedding 4 and 5 times, but the couple I'm thinking of had a date set early in May last year, and they said, we're going for it, and there were 5 people at their wedding. I stood in front of them. Their 2 moms were their witnesses. Some dads and siblings were out on the lawn, and neighbors were in the porches of their houses on the street because they wanted to get married in their new house on that day. What they didn't know is when they came out of the house, there were 2 white bicycles waiting for them, and they rode away. Now, we rehearse things at weddings. We didn't rehearse the bikes. The couples rode in opposite directions. And I'll leave you to determine who turned around and realized we better go down the street together. Just didn't know which street. But what I admired was they were working within the advice of medical professionals. And they said, this is the quality of life we want, is to get married today. So speaking of quality, I think of a nurse who was introducing herself well into her 90s. She would say, hello, I'm a nurse, how can I help? Did I add she was well into dementia by that point? And then got COVID and had to go to hospital. But this was at the depths of COVID. Her family could not even come in when the call came that she was actively dying. But a very wise nurse did a quick check how many nurses could be freed up long enough to be at the bedside. And there is an amazing picture of them that I don't have, but you can imagine it, all in PPE, holding hands around this nurse's bed with a camera up like Stephen or Judy would do for us to FaceTime the family into the death of this nurse. And when we did have a deferred service last August, it was most important that that story was told. The part about, hi, I'm a nurse, how can I help? But the celebration of her vocation, not the manner of her death. That was the quality of her life, and I dare say even of her death. We go up in this other corner, and we talk about that valuing. Another groom was disappointed because they kept moving the wedding. And he finally phoned me last Christmas, and again, I tell this story with his permission. He said, you know, I'm in my late 20s. I've had a very privileged life. I've always looked forward to what I know, and I've only really feared what I don't know. He said, moving this wedding 5 times, and they just got married 2 weeks ago, I'm happy to announce, he said, has taught me to try and look forward to what I don't know. To try and look forward to what I don't know. And he's pursuing that with his fiancée. And finally, in this bottom corner about the context of decisions, we used to call it the everything else that doesn't fit in between what the doctor's saying, what the patient's asking for, the quality of life. This bottom corner was the everything else. It's very important to ask yourself a question sometimes, what do I need? Or have somebody ask you that question. because it really gets you thinking. And recalling the ongoing challenge of indoor and outdoor funeral services and so forth, this was also at Christmas time when we were limited to 10. And there were 3 daughters, and we met to plan. One of them said, I'm not coming into a public building, and I completely respect that. Her sister said, okay, so there'll be 10 of us, including the presider, in the service we have. But what do we need? We need to have 12 people at the grave. We have 2 fiancés who are sitting in cars on their phones, and they need to be with us. And so one of the sisters looked at me and said, so, do you think we could bury Mom twice? We still tell that story around the funeral home. I don't make light of it, but it was a great idea. We said, why not? She said, my sister does not want to see the casket lowered, and I do. And I have 6 in my group, and she has 6 in hers, and our sister will be on FaceTime. So Grandma was buried twice. We repeated the prayers, we laid the flowers, the casket stayed up the first time, went down the second. And that tech link was something valued. So to say that the advice of experts, the quality of life, articulating your own wishes, and the context all leads us to remember, as Christians, and not everybody I served certainly in the hospital was, but if I knew they were, I'd look at that thing we'd drawn and say, just remember there's a cross at the middle of that window. None of us are the first ones to struggle with these things. This is the one we follow. It's wonderful to look up to that cross as we gather again in this sanctuary. He who has gone to prepare a place for us all. Well, attending one of those deferred services, I don't just lead funerals, I go to quite a few, including on Zoom. Remarkable to think there were 300 of us gathered for Mark. One of Stephen's supervisors, I didn't tell him I was making this connection to Hugh Reed, but a service that Hugh led was about the 23rd Psalm as text. And Hugh said it's important we use the King James Version. And Hugh is a good scholar, and he said, but I take the liberty to change one word, and I wonder if Stephen knows the word I'm about to change. Instead of surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, he said, try substituting the word pursued. Surely goodness and mercy will pursue us. Well, this is the psalm attributed to King David. Jesus knew it by heart in Aramaic. And I have a good friend in Waterloo who does not like that translation one bit. She thinks it sounds ominous to be pursued. But I don't think that was the psalmist's intent, and I know it wasn't Hugh's. Surely goodness and mercy shall pursue us. Well, another spiritual souvenir of pandemic is that lovely new setting of Psalm 23 entitled, Shelter Me. Father Mike Jonkus, a Roman Catholic in the United States, who wrote Eagle's Wings for us, and I believe you sang it here last weekend, The Spirit Moves Again, set this to music last summer and made a point, I was saying to Hubert earlier, that this be in the public domain for all of 2020. He collected not a dime for his writing. And I want to thank Paul in Abstentia out west, I believe, Hubert and Carrie for bringing it to life as a solo this morning, and partly as an homage to Mark Toes. That was the last time I had the privilege to work with Mark. He said, I love this. Let's make it part of the hymn sing. So those who were on that call that day will remember hearing it for the first time. Well, we're in the home stretch here of windows and poets and scriptures. It's a United Methodist minister and poet, Jan Richardson, who has helped to deepen my understanding of shelter. I put some of her words alongside what Father Mike wrote for us. She writes that memory is a creative act, changing slightly with each recollection as a shelter. We shelter in memory. It's not just a roof over our head. Not dwelling on the past, but helping to create a future. Sounds like an echo of the doctor's wisdom and Barnabas, too. Richardson adds, and I think of her holding a slinky when she says this, is this the time I need to stretch myself or let go? Is this the time I need to let go or stretch myself, she wonders. I also want to draw briefly on the poetry of a Waterloo musician named Laura Peet, who has also written a choral composition for pandemic called Take This Thread. It was debuted earlier this year and set to music. And listen to these words of assurance. Though the year seems lost, your thread stays with me. It's not the rift of how we listened, it's not the hurt, but how we held the note between hope and elegy, the note between hope and lament. I am so looking forward to getting back to these steps and sitting with the children as we've been able to do 18 months ago. And I guess I'm going to stay standing to tell this story because it begins at the stop of the flight of stairs. It's a story about a boy who bought a very special coffee mug for his grandfather. And he hid it down in the basement of the house. He hid this coffee mug down in the basement of the house. And on the morning that his grandfather was coming over, and now that grandparents still can start to again, Mom was in the kitchen. She was in on it. She was making a nice fresh pot of coffee, and the boy raced past his mom, shot down the stairs, and she listened for the excited steps of him coming back up. But what she heard instead was a sickening crash. She looked down the stairs, and there was the mug in so many pieces on the floor. So instinctively, that mom climbed down those steps and sat beside her boy who was sitting on the bottom step. Well, he was okay, but his head was in his hands. And she sat with him and said, for the longest time, I wanted to say something. She reflects on that moment. I wanted to tell him that it was okay, he wasn't badly hurt. Or I could give him some money and he could buy another mug. Grandpa can come another day for that. But something persuaded her to just sit there and listen. Or as the nuns say, don't just say something, sit there. Don't just say something, sit there. And all of a sudden, this boy jumps up and he turns to his mom and he said, well, I'm going to have to think of something else. I'm going to have to think of something else. I think God's presence is like that mom's presence, pursuing us, sheltering us, but without easy answers. And then together, we try to envisage a future that we want to be a part of, and together we find resilience. Together we find resilience.